I think you're right. It's one of the most hated taxes in the country. And that's despite the fact that actually a very small number of people actually pay it. So of all the people that died last year or inheritances that are liable for the tax, 96%, actually more than 96%, don't pay a penny of tax. It's only 4% of inheritances that are liable for the tax. And those are the biggest, most wealthy people, those most able to pay some tax on their inheritance. But I think the reason why it's so hated is that I actually agree with the points that you made at the beginning. It really speaks to that sense of justice and fairness, because whilst we have an inheritance tax which is comparatively high in rate, it actually doesn't collect that much revenue because the wealthiest and the well-advised are able to avoid paying it. So we see that the actual rates of inheritance tax reduce the higher and higher, the bigger those inheritances get. And that's because the wealthiest people are able to avoid paying it. And that means that it hits the middle classes most. And why really, I would agree with you that we should be getting rid of inheritance tax. But I would defend the idea of taxing inheritances at its heart, that it's a fair way of taxing wealth and unearned income. But we should get rid of inheritance tax and we should replace it with something which is far harder to avoid and much fairer.
But if you were to tax wealth on the death of someone, it is by any other name an inheritance tax. Would you be advocating then, and we're going slightly off subject here, but would you be advocating then abolish inheritance tax for some of the reasons that I've said and you agree with, but introduce taxing wealth? Because that's a whole other debate, isn't it?
It is a slightly different one. What I would be proposing is something called a lifetime receipts tax. And it's what some of our closest neighbours do. Ireland, for example, just over the border, our nearest neighbour, and France too. It's a fairer way of taxing inheritances because what it does is it captures the fact that some of the wealthiest people are able to give their wealth away earlier in their life. So in the UK, for example, if you give money to your children, or in fact to anybody, more than 7 years before you die, that's liable for no inheritance tax whatsoever. Now, the most people who are worried about paying inheritance tax, the majority of their estate will be made up of a house. It's an illiquid asset. They can't just give that to their children more than 7 years before they die. But the wealthiest people who have a large amount of cash or perhaps liquid assets like stocks and shares are able to give away lots of that earlier in their life to their children and to their inheritors and pay not a penny of tax. That's one of the biggest glaring unfairnesses.
Well, it's interesting because I was kind of nodding with you there because I like the idea that if I've earned this money or accumulated this wealth by, some would say luck, others would say judgment of having a house that's grown in value or assets, the idea that I'm passing it on to my family free of tax actually, I think, does a number of things. I think it's morally a great thing to do within families. I think it's the right thing to do. Secondly, it's actually freeing up spend that might otherwise not have been spent. There's a lot of reasons to say why it's a good thing, but you want to tax that. And I don't quite understand why you'd want to tax me gifting money to family.
Well, I think what we should move away from seeing it as a tax upon you as someone giving a gift and more upon the recipient. So I earn money through my work and I pay a level of tax on that. Now, what we're talking about with inheritance and gifts, that's unearned wealth. It's an unearned transfer of wealth.
In some
cases.
There's
no reason that should be taxed at a lower rate than work. I think it's fair that income from wealth should be taxed on the same rate as everybody else pays income tax on their income from work. So I think that's one thing. The second is that it's an important way of redistributing wealth in our society. We have some of the highest levels of wealth inequality in our society as a whole in the UK, the highest it's ever been in the 20th and 21st century. And it's right that we should try and address that through the tax system and ask those people who are the wealthiest and have these large inheritances or gifts to pay their fair share. Because inheritance tax as a whole raises something like 6 or 7 billion.
7.1 billion, yeah.
So it's a relatively small amount of the total tax take, but I think actually scrapping it and not replacing it with anything else would send a very strange priority, given the government is struggling with a whole other range of cost pressures.
Well, there's no question that the government would want to find the money somewhere else, I'm sure, but we're talking about a deeply unpopular tax. I think you said in this that you're talking about actually, in the cases of the lifetime allowance or inheritance tax, it's the recipient that's paying the tax. That isn't that isn't actually true for inheritance tax. And sorry, I'm not suggesting you're lying, but the fact of the matter is, it is your estate that is taxed. It is, and it's not the recipient. The recipient is going to get the net amount. So it is. If I drop dead now, if I'm fortunate enough to have lots of money to leave, it will be my estate that is taxed. So I think it is a tax on me, even though I'm not here to moan about it.
It is as it's currently designed, but I think if we scrapped it and replaced it with something fairer, it would remove that unfairness, which you're absolutely right, because it is currently a tax on the giver of that gift rather than the recipient. And that's one of the reasons why it's unfair, because if you were to drop dead, I don't know what your estate is, Nick, but if you were to give away £1 million to one person, that's very different to giving £10,000 to 100 different people. That the size of that would affect those people's lives in a totally different way. But at the moment, those are taxed the same way through an inheritance tax system. It would be fairer to treat £1 million gift differently to a £10,000 gift. That's what we do with all other forms of income, isn't it?
You're right.